Although yeast infections are not sexually transmitted diseases, STDs, or sexually transmitted infections, STIs, they do involve many of the same symptoms, such as vaginal itching, burning, pain, and discharge. For this reason, many people question whether sex is safe during a yeast infection or if you should wait until it clears up to protect yourself from further infection and keep your partner from developing one. Yeast infections are caused by an overgrowth of Candida albicans, a fungus that often lives in the vagina and other areas of the body. In most cases, you do not catch a yeast infection. It occurs when conditions in the vagina change and the yeast is able to grow and spread. Yeast infection, putting partners at risk. In general, yeast infections aren't spread from one partner to another during sex. Even so, there are situations when it does happen. Although men don't usually develop penile discharge, some men may get an uncomfortable rash on their penis if they have unprotected sex with a woman who has a yeast infection. The rate seems to be highest among men who are not circumcised. Diabetes, a weakened immune system, and antibiotic use can also increase the risk of yeast infection. In lesbian relationships, it's possible that yeast infections may be spread from one partner to another, although the issue has not yet been studied extensively. If your partner, male or female, begins to experience any signs of a yeast infection, such as itching, burning, redness, or discharge, he or she should see a doctor to confirm the diagnosis and begin treatment. Yeast infections and STD risk. Given the prevalence of STDs and yeast infections, it's not unreasonable for a woman to wonder whether a yeast infection may increase her risk of other vaginal infections. For the most part though, yeast infections aren't associated with developing an STD. In general, yeast infections do not increase the risk of contracting STDs, explains Rosanna Gray Swain, MD, a board-certified obstetrician-gynecologist in St. However, if there are scratches on the vulva, this can increase the risk of an STD infection. By scratching to relieve vaginal itching, you may inadvertently create microscopic tears in the skin that allow bacteria or viruses to enter your body more easily. Of particular concern is HIV/AIDS, which is most often spread through sexual activity. HIV/AIDS can also be transmitted through direct contact of bodily fluids with an open wound or a tear in the skin. One study looked at women who are not HIV positive but who were in a sexual relationship with someone who was. Researchers found that the women who eventually contracted HIV were more likely to have had yeast infections. They concluded that women in high-risk relationships should be taught how to prevent yeast infections, and to treat them quickly when they do occur, to decrease their risk of HIV infection. Since yeast infections can irritate the vaginal lining even if you haven't been scratching, it's a good idea to use condoms during sexual activity while you have a yeast infection, especially if your partner has not been tested for HIV. Of course, this is wise advice even when you don't have a yeast infection. Sexual activity during a yeast infection. Even though you may not feel your sexiest when you have a yeast infection, there's no medical reason not to engage in safe sex. Keep in mind, though, that the vaginal itching and burning associated with yeast infections may make sex uncomfortable. Another thing that might hinder you from having sex is the treatment method you're using. If a woman is using a cream therapy to treat an infection, it's best to delay intercourse until the therapy is complete, as sex can essentially push the medication out of the vagina, says Dr. Certain vaginal creams may also be irritating to a man's penis. Although yeast infections aren't dangerous for most people, they can cause discomfort with symptoms such as vaginal itching and burning. Decisions regarding sexual activity during a yeast infection ultimately depend on what you and your partner feel most comfortable doing.